Today I'm going to look at the terrariums that I haven't paid as much attention to in the last couple of status updates. That means I'm going to look at the indoor and front yard terrariums. But I don't want to completely leave out the others, so I'm just going to knock those out real quick here. Most of the backyard terrariums have started to grow really large algae mats. In fact, except for the carboy terrarium, they basically break down into two groups: the algae terrariums and the non-algae terrariums. I'd like to look into this further, but I think that'll have to wait for the next update. I don't expect it to change until the end of summertime, so there's probably still plenty of time to investigate it in more detail. As for the carboy terrarium, it's big enough that it doesn't seem to obey the same rules as the other ones. It also has a lot of algae growing near the soil, but further into the interior and higher up on the walls it's got a lot more going on. Finally, the two 2.0.1 terrariums that I made seem to be dying again, algae notwithstanding. Actually, I think the algae could be a cause of this because it could be consuming all the carbon dioxide and nutrients that the plants need. But I think the main reason everything's dying is just the heat. So, those are out of the way for today. The outdoor terrariums are continuing to evolve and there's more to look at, but we'll look at it later. On to the point. Okay, so these are the front yard terraria, and I haven't paid a lot of attention to them in the last couple of updates because, as you can see, they are dead. Now, so these two are 1.0 terraria from the very first batch, and this is the 1.1 terrarium that I put out later. And you can see that all of them are in basically the same condition, regardless of the little changes that I made. You can see that the lids have oxidized and turned like a little bit of a bronze color. They're steel and they're rusting. This one's a little newer, and you can see it's a little bit less so. It's trivial to the contents of the terraria, except that, of course, it means these physical containers won't last forever. You can also see that there's still water condensation on the insides of them, so they're not dead because the water all escaped. They're just dead because, pretty certain it's because it gets way too hot in there and there is an upper limit to how much heat the plants can take. So first off is the so-called native terrarium. This was the one that I made out of plants I harvested from my yard, and it was the first to die. It appears to have kind of lost a little mass. It's probably due to dehydration of everything and not really decomposition. I don't really see any signs of mold or anything that would be really decomposing these plants. So I don't expect any change. This may be mummified and it may not change at all, no matter how long we wait. But I am going to leave it out for the remainder of the year and see if things sprout again in the spring. There's also no sign of any kind of changes in the soil. So that's that one. Our second terrarium is also a 1.0 terrarium, and this is the creeping fig, oak leaf creeping fig. And there is a little bit of green still in there, but I do not believe that it's life. It could be. It may not have completely died off, but I think it's just that the chlorophyll hasn't completely broken down in here. So even though it's not alive, there is still a bit of greenness. You can see some young looking leaves that are completely bleached, and everything else is mostly burnt, rust colored or blood colored and brown. And likewise our moss has not shown any sign of growth. And just like the other terrarium, there's nothing particularly noteworthy in the dirt, although there was kind of a bacterial amount earlier, and we can see a little bit of a dead patch of algae here, but even that has gotten cooked. So I'm going to try to get a look at this with a microscope in a bit. Not a very good microscope, but still. But I don't expect to see much that I don't see here. Last terrarium is this 1.1 terrarium, which was the oak leaf creeping fig with somewhat less soil and a little more room and nothing else planted in there with it. And it's also dead, just like the others. I don't see much of anything interesting in the soil, but we can at least get sort of a better view of what the top of the soil layer looks like since it's not all covered up. And there's plenty of organic material in there, still nothing rotting. You don't even see any mold or fungus. There is a little bit of algae, I think, on the side here, which might still be alive. So that is, my lighting for this setup is terrible, but you can kind of see the color of it here. So there is some hope that this isn't entirely sterile. And like the others, I'm just going to let it sit in the front yard and see if it can survive August and September. So here we have the indoor terraria, which I've ignored much like the front yard ones for the same reason that they appear to be mostly dead. But they're dead in different ways from the front yard terraria, and I do still want to keep up with them. And unlike the front yard ones, they don't appear to be completely sterile inside. So let's take a look. So first off is this Hagelschwab jar. This is probably the least interesting of the bunch, although it still looks nice. It's because of the moss here. Now, the moss, as I've said many times, I think is sterile, but I'm going to try, it will be up in the next clip if I manage to do it. I'd like to take a look at some of the older footage and compare it to this and see if there's any sign of life. I feel like the tips of these are more finely spaced than they used to be, which would suggest it's growing new ones. But the last couple of times I've said, hey, I think I see some change in this, there hasn't actually been any change. So I wouldn't get my hopes up about that. However, about a week or two ago, the lid, the little cork, had popped up about 1/4 of an inch, or 1/8 of an inch to about here, and so I pushed it back down again. But the fact that it popped up suggests that there was a little bit of pressure buildup in here. It also means this isn't perfectly sealed, because it shouldn't be able to do that. The point being, there was something resembling change, so I want to take a look at it. The second one of these I'd like to look at is this moss. I think this was moss only. Yeah, moss only. This one is one of the healthier looking ones, in part because I have clearly living algae in it. So, algae's not much in the hydroponic system. That's an annoying bug, not a feature. But here, it's something alive. So, we have a really basic ecosystem, but at least it's something. As far as these mosses go, I really can't tell if they've grown any or not. Being moss, they're not real exciting to watch, but just like the other jar, I think there's a possibility that there might be something to see here. And last but not least is this 1.1 terrarium. And as you can see, there's a lot of condensation on it. Just like the others, it's mostly moss. In fact, this is the one that made me think, oh, maybe there's some growth here, because this is all very finely branched structure at the end of this, oh, well, that didn't work. There we go. Finely branched and slightly lighter at the end of this moss. So, if there's anything that's growing and still alive, it's that. Wouldn't surprise me if that's nothing, but it sort of looks like something. And then the Oakley creeping fig is dead. I haven't seen any sign of growth. It still looks a little bit greenish on camera, but it's a sickly brown color in person. Yeah. Okay, so that's all we can see at normal magnification. But I've got a new toy. That's a microscope. Don't get any weird ideas. It's not a great microscope. It says it'll do 1,000 times magnification, but it doesn't. I think the maximum is something like 100 times or 200 times. But that's still way better than my camera, which only does 5 times magnification. So, what do we see? Well, starting with the front yard terrariums, we see not a lot. The leaves are intact on one of the creeping fig plants, but they're all bleached white. The native terrarium has these white spiky structures on the leaves that could be a fungus, although I think it's much more likely that they're just a hairy textured structure on the leaf that just happens to appear this way when it dies. There are filaments of something white, probably fungus, growing in many places, and a few of these brightly colored strings that I think are just plastic contaminant, but they might be something else. The reindeer moss has been bleached and is clear in most places, with patches of this rusty reddish color. There's no sign of anything moving or alive in any of these, but some of the plants have obviously decayed. Whether that's still an ongoing process or something that has been stopped is an open question. In the soil, nothing much seems to be happening, although it certainly is interesting to see these grains of sand up so close. There's some slimy masses that seem to be what's left of the algae I saw growing in the spring when it was cooler out. It's possible this stuff is still alive even though it's changed from a vibrant green to this disgusting snot color. There's also a few reddish blobs of slime. I'm not sure what these are. I bought the microscope in the hope that maybe it would help me identify them, but I'm still mystified. Are they bacterial mats, red or brown algae, the decayed remnants of whatever poor invertebrates snuck in when I first made these things? Perhaps I'll never know. If anything is left alive in these, it's well hidden, so let's go ahead and take a look at the indoor terrariums. Well, the moss is still green at least, and the algae is a nicer green color, although still slimy looking, which I suppose is the normal texture for algae after all. Some of the moss tips have these blackish burnt looking bits, and some of them don't, which perhaps means that one or the other are still alive and growing, unless it just means that one's rotting and the other one isn't. But there's not a whole lot of evidence other than that in two of these terrariums. But the last terrarium, the all moss one, is a different story. There's a bunch of little bugs in here. They're all alive and moving around and everything. Apparently they're eating the algae or the rotting remnants of the moss or something, but they're alive. And there's a lot of them. It's mostly these little guys that look like springtails, but there's also some soil moss and soil mites and a few nematode worms. And they're all over the place, throughout the soil and up and crawling on the reindeer moss. This might be why everything dies out so quickly, especially in the 1.0 terrariums that were 2/3 of the way full with dirt. It may not look like it, but the soil's chock full of bugs all breathing the air, and there probably wasn't enough plant matter to support them. I'm not sure why these guys have pulled through when the other ones haven't, but my running theories would be either that A, they just got lucky and there was enough algae to produce the food and air for a sustainable population, or B, that this jar didn't seal very well. If that's the case, its small size would have helped because everything is right up next to the lid, so any air that does get in could diffuse to wherever it's needed most pretty easily. This is also a different container from most of the others. It's not a food container, so the sealing mechanism on the lid probably isn't as thorough. Unfortunately, the fact that these early terrariums were only sealed by screwing the lids on and hoping that would be sufficient means that I can't really distinguish between option A and option B. But I do know that no food or water has gotten in, and if any air has gotten through, it's probably not very much. So I'll take the win on this one. I think I can kind of draw some tentative conclusions from today's update. There definitely seems to be a problem with overheating of these terrariums. There's also some issues that seem to arise from the high surface area to volume ratio. Not only does this contribute to the overheating problem, but it provides a lot of space for algae to grow and for plants to catch diseases from the stagnant condensate on the glass. I also probably underestimated how much animal metabolism would be going on in the soil. For small terrariums mostly consisting of a thick soil layer, that really means there's not enough air. The most successful terrariums I've had so far all seem to have suspect seals or known leaks. Notwithstanding the moss terrarium that I just looked at, most of them also seem to have larger than average air gaps, and they're all located either indoors or in partial shade. The next terrarium, therefore, should probably be bigger than any of the ones that have come before it, and have a large air gap to provide a reservoir of breathable air and room for large plants to grow, and be provided with some kind of sunshade or other protection from the heat.